This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we end today's show with a figure who's been called the poet-philosopher of the ecology movement, author and activist Derrick Jensen has written some 15 books critiquing contemporary society and the destruction of the environment. In 2008, he was named one of Utne Reader magazine's 50 visionaries who are changing the world. Among his books, A Language Older Than Words, Endgame, What We Left Behind, and Resistance Against Empire. Derrick Jensen lives in Northern California. I had an extended conversation with him in San Francisco just a few weeks ago. Today we play part one of that discussion. I began by asking Derrick Jensen about the title of his book, what he means by deep green resistance.
Well, I think that we need to, I think a lot of us are increasingly recognizing that the dominant culture is killing the planet, and we can argue about whether there will be a few bacteria left or whatever, but when 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone, when there's 6 to 10 times as much plastic as phytoplankton in parts of the ocean, when there's dioxin in every mother's breast milk, when background rates or rates of extinction are 1,000 to 10,000 times background rates, it's sort of just playing with numbers to talk about whether it's killing the planet or simply mortally wounding it. And I think it's very important for us to start to build a culture of resistance, because what we're doing isn't working, clearly. I ask a lot of times why it is that environmentalists, I include myself as a frontline activist, I ask why it is that we lose so often. And there's a couple of answers that really speak to me. And one of them is that I think a lot of us don't really know what it is we want, and we don't think strategically very much. It's like, so what do you want? So I don't think that a lot of us think very clearly about what it is exactly we want. And I mean, I do know what I want, which is I want to live in a world that has more wild salmon every year than the year before, and I want to live in a world that has less dioxin in every mother's breast milk every year than the year before, and a world that has more migratory songbirds every year than the year before. And that's part of one of the reasons I think that a lot of times we don't win is, once again, I'm not sure that a lot of us know what we want. And then another problem is that there's this absolutely extraordinary book called The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton. And in this book, he describes how it was that men in this case, who had taken the Hippocratic Oath could work in Nazi death camps. And what he found was that many of the doctors who worked in the death camps actually cared very deeply for the health of the inmates. And Mengele was, horrible, but a lot of the sort of straight-line doctors were just, they would do whatever they could. They would give them an extra scrap of potato to eat, or the inmates, or they would hide them from the selection officers who were going to kill them, or they would...
To keep their experiments going?
No. They would hide them from the selection officers who were going to kill them. Mm-hmm. They would do this to protect the inmate for that day. They would put them to bed. They would actually do everything. If they were in pain, they would give them an aspirin to lick. They would do what they could to help, except for the most important thing of all, which is they wouldn't question the existence of the entire death camp itself. So they would find themselves working within the rules, however they could, to try to improve conditions marginally. And in retrospect, of course, that's just not sufficient. And as a longtime activist, I see myself and other activists doing the same thing, that what we do is we do everything that is allowed by those in power to attempt to stop their destruction. But the problem is, whenever we figure out a way to use their rules to actually stop them, they change the rules.
Derrick Jensen, deep green resistance, what form should it take?
Sometimes I get accused of being the violence guy because I talk about capital F fighting back. But I don't ever think that's really fair, because I really consider myself the everything guy, that I want to put everything on the table. And talk about all forms of resistance and decide whether they're appropriate or inappropriate for use. I don't want to go in prejudging. I think, for example, one man all by himself almost stopped World War II, George Elser. He was a trade unionist who didn't like what Hitler was doing to the trade unions. So he got a job in a mine, stole some explosives, and he knew every year on the anniversary of the beer hall putsch that Hitler would give a speech, and from 7:30 to 8:30. So he set a bomb to go off at 8:20, 1939. And unfortunately, because of the weather, Hitler gave his speech from 7 to 8 and left 20 minutes early. And so my point is, I think that in that case, and we can certainly parse out cases where we think it's appropriate to have militant response or non-militant response. But something I want to say about all that is that that's not the real question for me. The real question is the distinction between those people who do something and those people who do nothing. And I want to emphasize, too, that, for example, even the IRA at its strongest, or the U.S. military for that matter, only about 2% of the people ever pick up weapons. Most of the people are doing support work. I mean, Maud Gunn was central to the Gaelic literature revival. She wrote plays and she sang, and her son became the chief of staff of the IRA and later formed Amnesty International. And there's this, I guess all I'm trying to say is that we need to ask ourselves, what do we want? And then to ask ourselves, how are we going to get there? And those are not rhetorical questions.
I mean, there is an easy resorting to violence. I think comes from the model of the establishment. They like to say war is the last resort, but so often it is the first approach that the establishment takes, led by the military, and sometimes not led by. They're the ones that know the suffering the most, so it'll just be the civilian government. But do you want to take that model of violence as even a way to deal? I mean, imagine if you took violence off the table. You didn't justify the violence the establishment was doing by saying, or you didn't answer it by saying they're doing violence, so it has to be met with violence. I mean, from your life, you talk a great deal about your own growing up and the role that violence played and how incredibly destructive it was. Why don't we go there? Why don't you talk about how you came to be Derrick Jensen? What has shaped you, influenced you, both negatively and positively? But this issue of violence that is so real, unfortunately not a metaphor in your life.
Well, yeah. My father's extremely violent, was, presumably still is. I haven't talked to him for years. And he broke my sister's arm. My brother has epilepsy from blows to the head. He raped my mother, my sister, and me. And that one of the things and we can talk about the negative effects of that, many years of therapy, and we can talk about, the years of insomnia and the night terrors and all that. But I think the central way, there are a few people, I know you're not saying this, there are a few people who say, gosh, he just wants to fight back because he's projecting his own